You don't even have a bidder's badge. This isn't a museum, step aside. The words didn't echo, they sliced, clean and public, cutting straight through the low hum of a $20 million auction room where crystal chandeliers hovered above polished marble and quiet wealth sat dressed in tailored silence. Naomi Carter didn't move. She stood there, center aisle, in a fitted charcoal blazer, dark jeans, and simple heels, no diamonds, no labels, nothing loud enough for people like him to recognize. That was the point. Around her, paddles lifted lazily, million-dollar gestures made with the flick of a wrist, while servers in white gloves floated past with champagne no one offered her. A man brushed past her shoulder like she was part of the furniture. Another guest glanced, paused, then looked away, filing her under not relevant. Naomi's eyes tracked the room, steady, absorbing everything. This wasn't new. It never was. At 27, she'd walked into a gallery in Soho, ready to invest her first 7 figures, only to be handed a brochure and told to come back with a consultant. At 34, she'd been mistaken for staff at a private showing she later funded. And now, at 42, worth more than most of the people in this room combined, here it was again, same script, different walls. The auctioneer's voice carried across the hall, smooth and controlled, introducing the opening piece, a rare collection valued just under $3 million. Hands rose. Numbers climbed. Naomi didn't reach for a paddle. Because no one had given her one. A young assistant had passed her twice already without acknowledgement. A manager stood near the side, watching her now, not with curiosity, but calculation. Security shifted subtly, positioning closer, not touching, just enough to suggest boundaries. Naomi exhaled once, slow, deliberate. Her stillness didn't read as hesitation. It read as gravity. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Naomi Carter. The bid hit for $0.2 million. Applause flickered, polite, contained. Naomi tilted. Her head slightly, eyes narrowing not in anger but in clarity. They hadn't asked who she was. They had decided. The manager took a step closer now, voice lowered but firm enough to carry. This area is reserved for registered bidders only. Naomi turned her gaze to him, not rushed, not defensive. Just present. The kind of presence that made people second-guess what they thought they knew. For a second, just one, he hesitated. Then the moment passed. He gestured subtly toward the back. A dismissal without saying the word. Naomi didn't move. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and with the calm of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to reveal, she said softly, "Call Daniel." Full clearance. Now. And somewhere far above the room, where ownership lived and decisions traveled faster than assumptions, something had already begun to shift. The manager did not respond right away, but the subtle shift in his posture said everything, his confidence still there but now mixed with something thinner, something uncertain, because Naomi had not argued, had not raised her voice, had not played the role he had already assigned to her. She had simply made a call, and in rooms like this, calls mattered more than opinions. The auctioneer continued without pause, his cadence smooth, controlled, almost detached from the tension building just a few feet away. For $0.3 million, do I hear for $0.5? Paddles lifted again, the rhythm resumed, but the energy had changed, quieter now, tighter, as if the room itself was waiting for something it could not yet name. Naomi remained exactly where she was, shoulders relaxed, chin level, eyes forward, not on the manager, not on the security staff who had now taken another half step closer, but on the stage, on the art, on the system that was about to reveal itself, a woman seated 2 rows back leaned slightly toward her companion, whispering just loud enough to be noticed. Why are they treating her like that? Her companion did not answer, he only watched, the way people do when they sense a story unfolding in real time. The manager cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control of the moment. I am going to have to ask you one more time to step away from the bidding area. His tone was still polite, but now it carried an edge, a need to resolve what he had already escalated. Naomi turned her head just enough to meet his eyes, and for a brief second, the noise of the room seemed to fade, because there was no hesitation in her expression, no apology, no uncertainty. Just a quiet certainty that did not match the role he had placed her in. "I am exactly where I need to be," she said, her voice even, measured, not loud but impossible to ignore. The manager opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a subtle ripple moved through the staff along the walls, small, almost invisible gestures, earpieces touched, glances exchanged. A young assistant near the registration desk suddenly straightened, her eyes flicking toward Naomi, then down to the tablet in her hands, her fingers moving faster now. The auctioneer paused for the first time, just a fraction of a second, then resumed, but the rhythm was off, like a musician who had missed a beat. Naomi's phone remained in her hand, the screen dark now, the call already done, the instruction already in motion. The manager noticed the shift but could not yet explain it, and that lack of control pressed against him, tightening his tone. "Security will escort you if necessary," he said, not loud enough to cause a scene, but loud enough for the nearest bidders to hear, a statement meant to re-establish order, to remind the room who belonged and who did not. Naomi did not look at the security staff, she did not step back, she did not argue, she simply watched as the next piece was introduced, a rare sculpture, estimated at $5 million, the kind of piece that defined collections, that separated serious buyers from spectators. The auctioneer lifted his gavel slightly, preparing to open the floor, and in that suspended moment, when attention narrowed and value hung in the air, Naomi took one small step forward, not rushed, not aggressive, just enough to cross an invisible line that had been drawn for her, and somewhere behind the scenes, far from the polished marble and curated silence, a system had just recognized her name. The sculpture caught the light like it understood its own value, polished edges reflecting gold and shadow across a room that had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. The auctioneer's voice lifted again. "We will open at $5 million, but the confidence behind it wavered, just slightly, because the rhythm of the room was no longer his to control. Naomi Carter stood one step past where she had been told to stand, not in defiance, but in certainty, and that difference was beginning to register in places no one could see. The manager noticed it first in the staff, the way the assistant near the desk stopped ignoring Naomi and instead kept glancing at her screen, then back at Naomi, then back again as if confirming something she did not expect to find. Security did not move closer this time, they held position, waiting, watching, because something in the air had shifted from removal to hesitation. A man in the front row raised his paddle. $5 million, another followed. 5.2. The numbers climbed, but now every bid felt like it existed alongside something else, something quieter and far more important. Naomi did not lift her hand, did not ask for acknowledgement, she simply watched, her gaze steady on the sculpture as if she had already made a decision long before anyone else in the room even noticed the piece. The manager leaned slightly toward one of the staff members, whispering under his breath, trying to reassert order, but the response he received was not immediate. The assistant hesitated, then leaned closer to him, her voice barely audible. "Her name just came up," she said, and for the first time, the manager's expression cracked, not dramatically, not enough for the room to see, but enough for the control behind his eyes to flicker. "What do you mean her name came up?" he asked, still trying to keep his tone neutral, but the edge was there now, sharper than before. The assistant swallowed, glancing once more at the tablet. "She is in the system, pre-authorized, full access." The words landed quietly, but they carried weight, the kind that does not need volume to shift a room. The manager straightened, looking back at Naomi, seeing her now not as an interruption, but as a variable he had failed to calculate. The auctioneer called out again, $5.5 million, do I hear 6? A pause stretched across the room, longer this time, heavier, because attention had begun to split, half on the stage, half on the woman who had not moved. Naomi took another step forward, small, controlled, placing herself fully within the line of bidders without ever asking permission. A woman seated near the aisle lowered her paddle slightly, eyes fixed on Naomi, sensing the shift without understanding it. Naomi's voice came next, calm, clear, cutting through the layered noise without effort. $6 million. She did not raise a paddle, she did not signal, she simply spoke, and for a moment, the auctioneer froze, the room froze with him, because that was not how this worked, not here. Not in a place where access was controlled and status was signaled through small pieces of plastic and quiet approval. The manager stepped forward immediately, tension returning to his posture. You cannot place a bid without proper credentials, he said, louder now, needing the room to hear him, needing to reclaim structure before it slipped further away. Naomi turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze again, and this time there was something different in her eyes, not patience, not observation, but recognition, as if the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived. Then you might want to check your system again, she said, her tone unchanged, her presence unshaken, and behind the manager, the assistant did not move, did not speak, because she already had. The assistant did not need to speak again because the silence had already said enough. The manager's eyes shifted from Naomi to the tablet in his employee's hands, and in that single glance, everything he thought he controlled began to unravel, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet, precise way power corrects mistakes. Check it again, Naomi repeated, not as a challenge, but as a fact waiting to be confirmed. The assistant nodded quickly now, fingers moving across the screen, her earlier hesitation gone, replaced by urgency. She is listed under executive clearance, she said, her voice barely steady, full financial authorization, no bidding limit. The words did not travel far, but they did not need to. The manager heard them, and more importantly, he understood them. The auctioneer stood frozen for a fraction too long, the gavel hovering midair as if time itself had paused to catch up. Then he cleared his throat, attempting to restore order. We have a bid at 6 million, his voice carried again, but the smooth confidence from before had cracks in it now, visible to anyone paying attention. A man across the aisle raised his paddle quickly, 6.3, almost defensively, as if trying to pull the focus back where it belonged, but the room had already shifted. Naomi did not react to the competing bid, she did not rush, she did not adjust her stance, she simply stood there, grounded, certain. Her presence now heavier than the numbers being called out. The manager stepped closer to her. But this time there was no authority in the movement, only caution. He began, lowering his voice, trying to reshape the situation before it fully slipped beyond him. There may have been a misunderstanding earlier. Naomi turned to face him fully now, and for the first time, he was not speaking to someone he believed he could remove, he was speaking to someone he needed to understand. There was no misunderstanding, she said, calm, direct. Every word measured. You made a decision. Without information, the statement landed with more weight than any raised voice could have carried. Behind them, the assistant continued to scroll, pulling up more data, more confirmations, layers of verification that should have been checked from the beginning. Her account is already cleared through our corporate office, she added, louder this time, unintentionally, and a few heads turned, the words spreading faster than control could contain. The auctioneer hesitated again, then forced the process forward. 6.5 million, do I hear 7? But even he could feel it now. The bids were no longer the center of the room. Naomi took another small step forward, placing herself directly in line with the front row of bidders, no longer on the edge, no longer an exception, but fully present within the system that had tried to exclude her. Her voice followed, steady, unhurried. 7 million, again without a paddle, again without permission, and this time, the auctioneer did not question it. He did not pause, he simply repeated it, 7 million. Because something in the room had already decided that her voice carried more authority than the rules that had been used against her. Minutes ago, the manager stepped back slightly, the distance small but symbolic, his earlier certainty replaced by calculation, by the realization that every second of this moment was being witnessed, not just by the guests, but by the institution itself. Naomi's phone remained at her side, silent, but active, because somewhere beyond the walls of this room, confirmation had already reached the highest level, and what had started as dismissal was now becoming documentation, the kind that does not disappear, the kind that reshapes consequences. Naomi looked toward the stage again, her expression unchanged, but her presence now undeniable, and as the next bid hung in the air, waiting to be challenged, the room understood something it had not understood before. She was not here to be acknowledged, she was here to take control. The number 7 million did not echo the way the others had. It settled, heavy and deliberate, like it belonged to something deeper than competition. The room did not respond right away, not because the price was too high, but because the source of it had shifted the ground beneath everyone present. A man near the center raised his paddle halfway, then paused, his eyes fixed on Naomi as if recalculating more than just the value of the sculpture. The auctioneer looked across the room, searching for momentum. 7 million once, he called, but even his voice carried a question now, not certainty. Naomi did not move, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere beyond the reach of this room. The manager stood a few feet behind her now, no longer directing, no longer correcting, just observing, his earlier authority reduced to presence without control. The assistant stepped closer to him again, this time with no hesitation. "There is more," she said quietly, her screen angled slightly toward him. "Her profile is tied to a private acquisition account, multi-entity access. This is not a single purchase authorization." The manager's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in realization, because this was no longer about one bid, or one mistake. This was about scale, the kind that does not announce itself until it is already in motion. 7 million twice, the auctioneer continued, his tone more cautious now, as if aware that the next moment might not follow the pattern he expected. A soft murmur moved through the crowd, subtle but growing, not excitement, not yet, but recognition. Naomi took another step forward, closing the distance between herself and the front row completely, and in doing so, she erased the last visible line that had separated her from the rest of the bidders. No one stopped her, no one questioned it, because the system had already spoken louder than anyone in the room could. The man who had hesitated lowered his paddle fully now, leaning back in his seat, choosing not to compete, not because he could not, but because he understood that this was no longer a standard exchange. Naomi's voice came again, calm, precise. 8 million, the number landed without effort, without escalation, as if it were simply the next logical step in a process. Only she fully understood. The auctioneer blinked once, then repeated it, 8 million, and this time there was no pause, no confusion, only acceptance, because the room had adjusted. It had recognized the shift in authority and aligned itself accordingly. The manager exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes when control is no longer something you can recover, only something you can witness slipping away. Behind him, the assistant continued to monitor the system. More confirmations appearing, more layers of validation that should have been obvious from the start. Naomi's phone vibrated once in her hand, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but she glanced at it briefly, not to read, but to confirm, and that single glance was enough, because everything she needed was already in place. The auctioneer raised the gavel slightly higher this time, his voice steadier now that the structure had reformed around a new center. 8 million once, 8 million twice. The room held its breath, not in tension, but in anticipation, because everyone present understood that this moment was no longer about art, or price, or prestige. It was about power, quiet, controlled, undeniable, and Naomi Carter stood at the center of it, not asking to be seen, not demanding to be heard, but making it impossible for anyone to look away. The gavel hovered for a fraction longer than it should have, suspended in a moment that no longer belonged to routine. 8 million, sold, the auctioneer finally declared, and the sound that followed was not applause, not immediately, but a low ripple of realization moving through the room, because the outcome had not been surprising, it had been inevitable. Naomi Carter did not react with celebration, she did not smile. She simply inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the result as if it had already been accounted for long before the bidding began. The assistant at the desk exhaled quietly, her shoulders lowering as if she had been holding tension she did not understand until now. The manager remained still, his eyes fixed on Naomi, but no longer questioning her presence, now measuring the consequences of his own actions. The auctioneer moved to transition to the next piece, but the rhythm did not return, not fully, because attention had shifted permanently. Naomi's voice came again, not raised, not dramatic, but precise. "Pause the rotation," she said, and the words landed differently this time, not as a disruption, but as an instruction. The auctioneer hesitated, instinct pushing him to continue, protocol guiding him forward, but then his earpiece buzzed softly, and whatever he heard there stilled him completely. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will hold for a brief moment," he announced, his tone adjusted, deferential now in a way that had not existed before. A quiet stir moved through the guests, conversations beginning in low voices, speculation rising, but no one left, no one disengaged, because something larger was unfolding. Naomi stepped forward one more time, now standing at the edge of the stage itself, the place reserved for those who controlled the room, not those who observed it. The manager approached again, slower this time. "Careful, Miss Carter," he said, using her name for the first time, and even that felt like an admission. "If there is anything we can clarify," he began. But Naomi did not let him finish, not with interruption, but with presence. She turned slightly toward him, her gaze steady. "You have already clarified everything," she said, her tone even, but the weight behind it undeniable. the assistant's tablet chimed again, a new notification flashing across the screen. She glanced at it, then looked up quickly. "The executive office just confirmed," she said, unable to keep the urgency from her voice. "Full acquisition authority has been granted." The words moved faster this time, carried by the shift in energy that no one could contain anymore. The manager's expression changed again, not confusion, not resistance, but something closer to realization, because this was no longer about a single item, or a single moment. Naomi turned her attention back to the stage, to the collection itself, each piece carefully selected, curated, valued, and she spoke again, calm, controlled. "I will take the entire collection." The sentence did not rise, did not demand attention, but it commanded it. Completely, the room went still, not out of shock, but out of understanding, because this was not impulse, this was intent, structured, prepared, inevitable. The auctioneer blinked, processing, then looked toward the manager, who did not respond immediately, because the decision was no longer his to make. It had already been made somewhere above them all. Naomi's phone vibrated once more, and this time she did not look at it. She did not need to, because the system had aligned fully, and the room, for all its wealth and exclusivity, had just realized that it had never been in control to begin with. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and irreversible. "I will take the entire collection," and for a moment, no one moved, not the auctioneer, not the manager, not even the guests who had spent the last hour competing for individual pieces, because what Naomi Carter had just done was not part of the script. It bypassed the ritual, the pacing, the illusion of control that the room depended on. The auctioneer lowered the gavel slowly, his eyes shifting toward the manager again, searching for direction. But the manager did not step forward this time. He did not interrupt, because the authority he had tried to enforce minutes ago no longer belonged to him. It had already been transferred, confirmed, documented. The assistant's tablet chimed again, louder now in the silence, and she did not hesitate. "Corporate has approved the full acquisition," she said, her voice carrying across the front rows without intending to. "All items, immediate transfer authorization." A murmur broke out across the room, no longer contained, no longer polite. People turned in their seats, whispering, recalculating, realizing that what they had witnessed was not just a purchase, it was a takeover of the moment itself. The man who had bid earlier leaned back fully now, shaking his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement, because he understood the difference between wealth and control, and what Naomi had just demonstrated was not about numbers, it was about access. Naomi stood at the edge of the stage, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the outcome had always been inevitable. The manager finally stepped forward again, but this time there was no attempt to guide her, no effort to correct her position, only a measured approach. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice lower now, "careful, we will begin processing immediately." The shift in tone was clear, not just to Naomi, but to everyone within earshot, because respect had replaced assumption, and it had happened without her asking for it. Naomi gave a slight nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement of a system finally catching up to reality. The auctioneer cleared his throat, adjusting his stance. "Ladies and gentlemen, the remainder of today's collection has been acquired," he announced, and this time the words carried weight, finality, a conclusion that no one had expected. When the evening began, a few guests began to stand, not to leave, but to get a better look, to confirm what they had just heard, because moments like this did not happen often, and when they did, they rewrote the room. The assistant moved quickly now, coordinating, confirming, her earlier hesitation replaced by precision, because she understood what was at stake. Naomi's phone buzzed once more, and this time she lifted it, glancing briefly at the screen. A single message, simple, direct, confirmation complete. She lowered it again without comment, because she did not need to announce what had already been seen. The manager stood beside her now, not in front, not blocking, but slightly behind, a position that spoke louder than any apology could. Naomi turned her gaze across the room, taking in the faces that had once dismissed her, the subtle shifts in posture, the lowered eyes, the quiet recognition spreading from row to row, and then she spoke, not loudly, not for attention, but with a clarity that carried to every corner. "You did not ignore me," she said, pausing just long enough for the room to listen. "You revealed your standards." The sentence landed without force, but it stayed, settling into the space where assumptions had once been, and in that moment, the room understood something it could not unlearn. That power does not need to announce itself. It only needs to be recognized, and Naomi Carter had just made that recognition unavoidable. the room did not return to normal. It could not, because something fundamental had shifted and everyone felt it, even if they could not explain it out loud. Conversations that had once been confident were now cautious, measured, as if every word needed to pass through a new filter before being spoken. Naomi Carter did not chase their attention, she did not linger on their reactions, she simply stood where she was, composed, grounded, allowing the weight of what had just happened to settle. Without interruption, the assistant moved quickly between stations now, coordinating confirmations, her earlier uncertainty replaced by precision, because the system was no longer catching up, it was executing, screens updated, records aligned, ownership transferred in real time, and each silent update reinforced what the room had already witnessed. The manager remained a step behind Naomi, not out of instruction, but out of instinct, because the space in front of her no longer belonged to anyone else. A woman from the second row stood slowly, her eyes fixed on Naomi, not with curiosity anymore, but with something closer to respect, recognition that arrived late but arrived fully. A man near the aisle adjusted his jacket, glancing around as if trying to understand how quickly control had changed hands without a single raised voice. The auctioneer stepped down from the platform, no longer the center of attention, just another part of a system that had been redirected. Naomi's gaze moved across the room once more, not searching, not judging, simply observing. And in that observation was a quiet memory that surfaced without warning, not loud, not dramatic, but present. She was 19 again, standing in a small gallery just off Market Street, holding a printed portfolio, her ideas, her plans, her future in a folder that no one bothered to open. The man behind the desk had glanced at her once, then past her, asking if she was there for a delivery. She had corrected him, calmly, clearly, but it had not changed anything, not that day. She remembered the feeling, not anger, not even embarrassment, but clarity, the kind that sharpens over time, the kind that builds instead of breaks. That memory did not linger, it did not slow her down, it simply aligned with the present, reinforcing what had always been true. This moment was not new, it was the continuation of something much longer, something she had already outgrown. Naomi returned fully to the room, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. The assistant approached her carefully now, holding a digital tablet. "All transfers are in progress," she said, her voice respectful, precise. "Documentation will be finalized within the hour." Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the process, not needing the detail, but recognizing the structure behind it. The manager shifted slightly, then spoke again, his tone controlled, but no longer authoritative. "If there is anything further we can provide," he began, but Naomi lifted her hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to conclude. "You already have," she said, and the meaning settled between them, not as confrontation, but as truth. The manager lowered his gaze briefly, understanding that the moment did not require correction, only acceptance. Across the room, the energy continued to change. Guests who had arrived expecting to compete now stood witnessing something else entirely, something they would talk about later in quieter rooms, trying to explain how it happened so quickly, how someone they had dismissed had redefined the entire space without ever raising her voice. Naomi turned slightly toward the exit, not in retreat, but in completion, because she had not come to stay, she had come to act, and now that the action was done, the room no longer held anything she needed. But as she took her first step away from the stage, the assistant's tablet chimed again, sharper this time, more urgent, and the assistant's expression shifted, just enough to suggest that whatever came next had not been part of the original plan. The chime did not belong to the room, it cut through it, sharp, precise, carrying a different kind of authority than anything that had happened so far. The assistant froze for half a second, eyes locked on the screen, then looked up at Naomi, not with confusion, but with urgency layered under control. "There is an additional directive," she said, her voice lower now, careful, as if the words themselves carried weight beyond the room. Naomi stopped mid-step, not turning fully, just enough to acknowledge without breaking her rhythm. "From where?" she asked, calm, direct, because in her world, source mattered more than volume. The assistant swallowed lightly, then answered, "Executive board," and that changed everything again, not visibly at first, but in the way the manager straightened, in the way the remaining staff instinctively shifted their attention. Because board-level involvement did not follow moments like this unless something larger was being activated. Naomi turned fully now, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, but the room felt it, the subtle return of focus. The assistant stepped closer, angling the screen slightly. "They have initiated a compliance review," she continued, each word deliberate. triggered by internal flags during your acquisition authorization. A ripple moved through the staff, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable, because compliance was not about transactions. It was about behavior. The manager's expression tightened. Again, this time not from uncertainty, but from recognition. He understood what that meant, what it could uncover, what it could lead to. Naomi did not react immediately. She let the information settle, the same way she had let everything else settle, without rush, without emotion, just clarity, scope. She asked, one word, but it carried precision. The assistant glanced back at the screen. Full event review, staff conduct, access protocols, guest interaction logs, she said, then added. Quietly, effective immediately. The silence that followed was heavier than before, not because of surprise, but because of consequence. Guests nearby began to notice the shift again, conversations lowering, attention redirecting, because something deeper was unfolding beneath the polished surface of the evening. The manager took a step forward, his voice controlled, but no longer neutral. Ms. Carter, I assure you we maintain the highest standards. He began, but the words did not carry the same weight they would have earlier. Not now, not after everything that had already been seen. Naomi looked at him, not sharply, not dismissively, just directly. Standards are not statements, she said, her tone even, they are patterns. The sentence landed clean, leaving no space for interpretation. The manager did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to counter, only something to face. Behind him, the assistant's tablet continued to update, more notifications appearing. Timestamps, flagged interactions, system logs aligning in real time, each one a piece of a larger picture being assembled beyond the room. Naomi's phone vibrated again, and this time she answered it, lifting it to her ear with the same calm precision she had carried from the beginning. Go ahead, she said, and a voice on the other end responded, clear, composed, the review is live, we are seeing the full sequence. Naomi listened, her expression unchanged. Proceed, she replied simply, then lowered the phone. The room watched without understanding the details, but feeling the shift, because authority does not need explanation to be recognized. The assistant stepped back slightly, giving space, not out of instruction, but out of awareness. The manager remained where he was, no longer attempting to lead, only waiting, because the moment had moved beyond him completely. Naomi looked across the room one more time, not to measure reactions, not to confirm anything, but to acknowledge the space as it now existed, fully revealed, fully documented. And then she spoke again, not loudly, not dramatically, but with finality that settled deeper than any announcement. Now it begins, she said, and this time, the silence that followed was not uncertainty, it was understanding. The silence after her words did not feel empty, it felt active, like something had been set into motion that no one in the room could stop or redirect. Naomi Carter lowered her hand from the phone and did not speak again immediately, because she did not need to. The system was already speaking for her. The assistant's tablet continued to populate with updates, each one arriving faster than the last. Timestamps aligning with recorded interactions, internal logs surfacing conversations that had been invisible just minutes ago. The manager felt it before he fully understood it, the subtle shift from being observed to being evaluated, and that distinction changed everything. He adjusted his stance, not to regain control, but to steady himself within a situation that was no longer his to manage. The auctioneer remained off to the side, no longer attempting to resume the event, because the event itself had been redefined. A guest near the back whispered to another, asking what was happening, but the answer did not come in words. It came in the behavior of the staff, in the way their movements had slowed, in the way their attention had turned inward instead of outward. Naomi stood at the edge of the stage, not elevated, not separate, but central in a way that did not require position. Her presence alone now carried more weight than any title announced earlier in the evening. The assistant stepped forward again, careful but composed. The review has expanded, she said quietly. It is pulling archived interactions from previous events. The implication settled immediately. This was not a moment being corrected, this was a pattern being uncovered. Naomi nodded once, not surprised, because patterns were what she had always been measuring, not isolated moments. The manager spoke again, his voice controlled but noticeably lower. Ms. Carter, we are committed to addressing any concerns. But the words did not land the way he intended, because they belonged to a version of the situation that no longer existed. Naomi turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze with the same calm clarity she had held from the beginning. Concern is what you say when you still have time, she said, her tone even. "This is already recorded." The difference between the two states hung in the air, unmistakable. The assistant's tablet chimed again, and this time she did not need to read it aloud. Her expression alone was enough. The system was not slowing down, it was accelerating. More confirmations, more cross-references, more alignment. Naomi's phone vibrated once more, and she glanced at it briefly. A message from Daniel, simple, precise, audit team deployed, real-time oversight active. She placed the phone back at her side without comment, because the structure she had activated was now fully engaged. The room began to shift again, not in chaos, but in awareness. Guests who had arrived as participants were now witnesses, and that role carried a different kind of weight. Some stood, some remained seated, but all were watching, because they understood that what was happening was no longer about art or acquisition, it was about accountability. The manager took a small step back, not instructed, not directed, but because the space in front of him no longer belonged to him. Naomi looked across the room. Once more, not searching, not measuring, simply acknowledging what had been revealed, and then she spoke, her voice steady, unforced. "You built a system that decides who belongs before it asks who they are," she said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle. Now the system is answering back. The sentence did not rise, did not demand attention, but it carried through the room with a clarity that could not be ignored, and in that moment, everyone present understood that this was no longer a correction, it was a turning point, one that would not be undone once the night ended. The words did not fade when she finished speaking, they stayed, settling into the corners of the room like something permanent, something that would not be undone once the doors closed and the lights dimmed. Naomi Carter did not move immediately, because movement was no longer necessary to command attention. The room had already aligned around her presence. The assistant's tablet continued to glow with updates, each notification a quiet confirmation that the system was not just observing but responding. Real-time adjustments, flagged behaviors, internal notes being recorded with precision that left no space for interpretation. The manager stood still, his earlier confidence now replaced with something more controlled, more cautious, because he understood that this was no longer about correcting a moment, it was about being part of a record that would outlast it. A senior staff member from the back of the room approached slowly, not hurried, not panicked, but deliberate, carrying a different kind of authority, one that came from responsibility rather than position. She leaned slightly toward the manager, her voice low but firm. "The board is requesting immediate staff alignment," she said, and that phrase alone shifted the weight in the room again. Alignment did not mean discussion, it meant adjustment, it meant accountability already in motion. The manager nodded once, but the gesture lacked certainty, because for the first time, he was not the one directing the outcome. He was part of it. Naomi watched this unfold without interruption, her gaze steady, not focused on any one person, but on the system as a whole, because that was where the real change happened, not in individuals, but in structures. A guest near the front stood fully now, no longer pretending to observe casually, his expression thoughtful, almost unsettled, as if he had just witnessed something he could not easily explain but would not forget. The auctioneer remained silent, his role concluded without announcement, because the event he had been guiding had transformed into something else entirely. Naomi's phone vibrated again, and she answered it without hesitation, her voice calm, measured. "Status," she said, and the response came quickly, clear and direct. "Review complete on initial layer, multiple deviations confirmed, escalation approved." Naomi listened, her expression unchanged, then replied with a single word, "Proceed," and ended the call. She lowered the phone slowly, not with finality, but with continuity, because what had started here was no longer confined to this room. It had extended beyond it, into processes and decisions that would continue long after the guests had left. The assistant stepped forward once more, her tone respectful, precise. "They are requesting your confirmation on next phase actions," she said. Naomi nodded slightly, acknowledging the request without urgency, because urgency belonged to those trying to catch up, not to those who had already set the pace. She looked across the room again, not to assess, not to judge, but to acknowledge the full picture now visible in front of her, the staff, the guests, the structure that had revealed itself without resistance once it was challenged correctly. And then she spoke, her voice steady, carrying without force. "Do not correct what happened tonight," she said, pausing just long enough for the words to land. "Document it, because this is the system as it is, not as you claim it to be." The sentence did not rise, did not demand agreement, but it settled into the space with clarity that no one could ignore. The senior staff member nodded slightly, understanding the instruction for what it was, not a request, but a directive rooted in something larger than the moment. The manager lowered his gaze briefly, not out of defeat, but out of recognition, because the situation had moved beyond explanation, beyond defense, into something that required acknowledgement. Naomi turned slightly, her posture unchanged, her presence still central even as she prepared to step away, because the work had already begun, and it would continue whether she stood in the room or not. And as she took that first step, the room did not return to what it had been. It could not, because it had just been shown exactly what it was. The step she took did not signal an exit, it marked a transition, and everyone in the room felt it even if they did not fully understand it yet. Naomi Carter moved with the same calm precision she had carried from the moment she arrived, not rushed, not hesitant, but deliberate, as if every movement was aligned with something already decided. The space behind her did not close, it remained open, changed, redefined by what had just occurred. The senior staff member who had stepped forward earlier now turned toward the rest of the team, her voice low but firm, issuing instructions that did not require repetition. All interaction logs are to be preserved, no alterations, no omissions, she said, and the staff responded immediately, not out of fear, but out of recognition that the process had moved beyond them. The manager stood still for a moment longer, then finally spoke, not to Naomi this time, but to his own team. Full cooperation, he said, the word simple, but carrying a weight they had not held before, because they were no longer optional. Naomi continued toward the exit, her presence still anchoring the room even as she moved away from its center. A guest near the aisle stepped aside instinctively, not out of obligation, but out of respect that had arrived too late to shape the beginning, but just in time to define the end. The assistant followed a few steps behind, tablet in hand, still receiving updates, still part of a system that was now fully active. Audit teams are requesting access to prior event footage, she said quietly, keeping pace without interrupting Naomi's movement. Naomi nodded once, acknowledging without slowing, because this was expected, not reactive. Granted, she replied, her voice even, confirming what had already been set in motion. Behind them, the room continued to adjust, guests speaking in lower tones, staff moving with heightened awareness, every action now part of a record that could not be undone. The auctioneer remained near the platform, his role concluded without ceremony, watching as the structure he had operated within was examined from above. Naomi reached the edge of the main hall, the doors just ahead, tall, polished, reflective, and for a brief moment, her reflection met her gaze, not as a question, not as doubt, but as confirmation. The same presence, the same control, the same clarity that had carried her through every version of this moment before. The assistant's tablet chimed again, and this time the update was different, not procedural, but conclusive. Initial findings have been filed, she said, her voice steady. Preliminary actions are being recommended. Naomi paused just short of the exit, not turning back, but allowing the words to settle, because this was where intention became consequence. She spoke without raising her voice, without addressing anyone directly, yet the words carried back into the room with unmistakable clarity. Accountability is not punishment, she said, it is alignment with truth. The sentence moved through the space, quiet but irreversible. The manager heard it, the staff heard it, even the guests who had remained to watch heard it, because it did not belong to any one person, it belonged to the moment itself. Naomi placed her hand lightly on the door, not to push it open immediately, but to mark the end of her role within the room, because what needed to happen next would not require her presence, it would require the system she had activated, and that system was already working. She stepped forward, crossing the threshold without hesitation, leaving behind a space that could not return to what it had been, because it had been seen, fully, clearly, without distortion, and once something is seen like that, it does not disappear, it changes everything that follows. The door closed behind Naomi Carter with a quiet finality that did not echo but lingered, like a line drawn that no one inside could cross back over. The hallway beyond was calm, controlled, untouched by the tension that still lived in the room she had just left. Her steps were measured, steady, heels soft against polished flooring, not rushed, not delayed, because she was not leaving something behind, she was moving forward from something already completed. Her phone vibrated once more, and this time she answered without slowing. Status, she said, her voice even, and the response came instantly. Phase 1 complete, preliminary actions approved, internal suspensions initiated pending full review. Naomi listened, her expression unchanged, because this was not reaction, this was structure. ensure documentation remains unaltered, she replied, her tone precise, no narrative adjustments. There was a brief pause on the line, then confirmation, understood, and the call ended. She lowered the phone, not with finality, but with continuity. Because what had begun would continue without interruption. Back inside the room, the shift had fully taken hold. The senior staff member now stood at the center, directing quietly but firmly, roles redefined in real time. The manager no longer led, he responded, his earlier authority replaced by accountability. The assistant remained focused, every update recorded, every interaction preserved. Because nothing from that evening would be lost, not anymore. A guest near the front spoke softly to another, not with disbelief, but with recognition. She never raised her voice, and the response came just as quietly. She did not have to, because that was what remained, not the numbers, not the acquisition, but the way it had been done, controlled, deliberate, undeniable. Naomi reached the end of the corridor where glass doors opened to the night, city lights stretching out beyond, steady, constant. Indifferent to what had just unfolded inside, she paused for a moment, not to reflect, not to question, but to acknowledge, because moments like that were not about emotion, they were about alignment, about confirming that the system she had built, the structure she had trusted, functioned exactly as it was meant to. Her reflection caught briefly in the glass, not as a reminder, but as proof, the same calm presence, the same clarity that had walked into the room without announcement and left it completely changed. Her phone remained still now, silent, because the next phase did not require her voice, it required the system to continue without interruption. Inside, the final confirmations were being logged, access permissions adjusted, review panels assembling, and for the first time, the room was no longer performing status, it was confronting truth. Naomi stepped forward, pushing the glass door open, the night air cool, steady, real, and as she crossed into it, the distance between who she was and what they had assumed disappeared completely, not corrected, not explained, but exposed, and in that exposure was something no one inside could undo, because they had not just seen her, they had seen themselves. And that was the part that would stay, long after the art was moved, long after the room was reset, long after the story was told again in quieter voices, trying to capture what could not be softened. She did not need to turn back, she did not need to confirm anything, because the proof was no longer hers to carry, it was theirs to live with. And as she walked into the night, her final words from earlier settled into the space she left behind, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a truth that would outlast the moment. She had not needed a badge, she had not needed recognition, she had become the standard by which the room would now be measured.